Good morning, church. Once again, obviously, I'm joining you by way of video. It just turns out it's hard to find a supply preacher sometimes, um, and they're all busy. And so, since this plan worked pretty well last time, I thought I could go ahead and record another sermon ahead of time. So, right now, at this very moment, as you watch and listen, I am hopefully neck deep in games and just exhausted from all the fun that I've had this weekend, and enjoying seeing friends that I haven't seen, in some cases, in a long time, and seeing other friends that I see regularly, but I always want to see more of. So with any luck, that's where I actually am, and you are getting this sermon that I recorded ahead of time. So I wanted to talk briefly about our two readings, and then about one of the themes that I think they both touch on, and we'll see where that takes us. Our reading from 1 Thessalonians is a response to a problem and a question that existed at the time that doesn't really exist for us anymore, most of the time. In the years after Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension, as Christianity was this slowly spreading sect of Judaism, there was this expectation that history was going to end very soon, that Jesus was going to return in glory and judge the powers of the present darkness, and that the culmination of history that people had been hoping for was coming very soon. And so what happened was, in this early Christian movement, people were waiting with anticipation, something that they thought was going to happen in the near future, and people started dying. They started passing away from old age, or from sickness, or from accidents, like anyone can, and also the persecution of Christians became more and more lethal, as the Roman Empire decided they needed to hunt them down because they were a threat to empire. And so there was this question, anxiety, maybe despair at the time of, like, what is going to happen if someone dies before Jesus comes back? Like, what is going to occur? And so in this passage from Thessalonians, which is the first letter, as far as we know, it's guessed to be the first letter that Paul wrote. He's trying to reassure people that even though some of us have died before Jesus returns, that those people are no less going to be redeemed by Jesus. They're no less going to be resurrected and restored to life. And he gives sort of a vivid imagery for what that will look like, as a way to give people hope and to let them know that at this point it's been about 20 years after Jesus, give or take, and so there's a sense that people are realizing that they're settling in for a longer wait than they expected, and that had to bring about some changes in theology and in approach and in the way they thought about what it was they were doing. Less kind of warning people that the end was near, and so you have to be right with God, and more building something that would have to last, possibly longer than they themselves would live, which for some people was a surprise, and for some people it was frightening or disappointing. Our second reading from Matthew is also about waiting, but it's a response from Jesus to another group of people who perhaps were assuming that they had a place in the kingdom of heaven because they had a particular theology, particular beliefs, or because they had a particular ideology, a particular political allegiance, or even because they were from a particular ethnicity. And so Jesus portrays these women waiting for the bridegroom to welcome them into a wedding party. and they're all waiting, but some of them are wise, and some of them have planned ahead and are ready, and others are have not planned ahead and are not ready and are a little negligent. And when they have to leave to get ready, the bridegroom comes through, and by the time they're back, the door is closed and they can't come through it. Both of these readings, I was thinking about them, both of these readings have to do, in their different ways, with heaven. The kingdom of heaven, the resurrection, the end of history, Jesus' judgment, the finality of it. And so I thought that I would just kind of look at heaven as an idea historically, and then talk about one of the aspects of it that I think are really important by the end. This is also a question that comes up a lot. Like, I have right next to me, actually, the cards from the kids with their questions on them. Got some more over here. And a number of those questions are about heaven. There are also questions certainly adults have. And I suppose it's also been in my mind to some degree because we've had a number of people pass away, what feels relatively recently. I'm in the midst of planning a couple more memorial services, and so that's also kind of where my mind is, if I'm honest. But I wanted to talk about heaven and give kind of a basic layout, some history as I understand it, ideas around heaven as I understand them, and then end with, I guess, what I want to put forward as very important, or maybe even most important. So early on in the Old Testament, and for much of the Old Testament based on the text, heaven, the Hebrew word is shamayim, which means just the heavens. And the heavens are basically just the sky. When you look up, that's the heavens. And somewhere up there in that realm is where God and, for a while, the other gods lived. That they kind of had their court, they had their realm above. Now, I don't know if we can say that people literally thought this was true, or if it was metaphorical, that the gods are above us in wisdom and power and even hierarchy, the way that the sky is above us physically. Like, I don't know exactly what they thought of this, but in the very basic terms, heaven, the heavens, were what is up. The sky, the clouds, the stars, the sun, the moon, etc. And this is where God's court existed. First, where there were many gods, of which only Yahweh was the God of the Hebrews, and then over time that changes into there's only one true God, and then there are false gods. But however you imagine it, heaven is up where the realm of the gods are. And not only the gods, not only God, but their kind of royal court. Like, people imagined that God was something like a king, like an earthly ruler. And so kings had court and functionaries and armies and messengers. And so they kind of imagined that God's court might be very similar. And so you have the angels, who are God's messengers, and the heavenly host, God's army. And you even have court functionaries like, for example, Ha-Satan, the Satan, which means the accuser or the adversary, or something like a prosecuting attorney, where, in the Old Testament, when it talks about Satan in, for example, the book of Job, Satan isn't God's opposition necessarily. Satan isn't anywhere near as powerful as God. Satan serves God. And Satan's job is like a prosecutor. Satan's job is to test people, and to make sure that their faith and their commitment is genuine. So anyway, heaven is up and is where God lives, and then human beings live on the earth, and that is the realm for us. And in the early texts and for most of the Old Testament, there wasn't really a sense that you would die and go to heaven, because heaven is where God is. You don't go there. You might see glimpses of it in dreams, but you don't go, generally speaking. When you die, you go to Sheol, which is just the grave. Heaven is up, Sheol is down, and Sheol is just where everyone who dies goes. And it's not a particularly interesting place. It's not a place of punishment. It's not a place of reward necessarily. It's just the place that you go. It's a lot like Hades in Greek religion and hell in Norse religion. This is the place that the dead go. And so the idea of heaven isn't like a reward for your life. For the Hebrew people, life was the reward. And your eternity would be the way you're remembered and the way your actions echo through the ages, the way your children behave and your children's children behave, and all those sorts of things. Over time, there, especially in the prophetic tradition, there comes to be this sense that history has a culmination, that God is moving the world toward a goal, which would eventually grow into this idea of the kingdom of heaven. But the prophets present God's goal for the world, that God has a purpose and there's an end state. At some point, the world will stop changing very much, and it will be the world that God intends. So it's going to be a world of peace, it's going to be a world of justice, it's going to be a world of equality. And from those ideas, that idea of God's shalom, swords being beaten into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, everybody has their own house and their own vineyard, and no one intimidates them, no one coerces them any longer. These are images that get to be associated with heaven, which is kind of God's purpose. There are two examples of people who are taken up directly into heaven in Hebrew scriptures. One is Enoch, the other is Elijah. These are interesting cases. I'm not going to follow the rabbit hole very far, but I just wanted to note that the idea that you died and went to heaven was so unusual that it only happened twice, and that they're, for two really major characters in the Hebrew scriptures, and it also isn't entirely clear why that happens. Maybe they served so well on earth that they're brought up to serve God in heaven. It just isn't clear. Or at least I'm not going to go into the questions it raises. Fast forward a bit to the New Testament, and there is now this idea in Judaism, among some people at least, that heaven is a place that you go after life, after you die, and it's a place that you go immediately. And so when Jesus is on the cross and he says to the one person being crucified, "Today you will be with me in paradise," right? There's this idea that you will die and you'll go somewhere, or your soul will go somewhere. Another way that Jesus describes it is the bosom of Abraham. And there is this idea in some of Judaism at the time that when you die, you go to a temporary place that is not Sheol. It's with God or closer to God, but it's still a place of waiting or a place of preparation. It's not your permanent home. You're not going to be there forever, but you're going to be there temporarily. And what you were waiting for the people who believed in this at the time, because it was divided over whether this was true, what you're waiting for is the resurrection. You're waiting for a general resurrection of the living and the dead. I guess not of the living, but a resurrection of the dead back to life, and then God's final judgment, and then a new heaven and a new earth where you will live forever. During Jesus' life, there was a debate over resurrection. There was a camp theologically and politically that said there's no resurrection, similar to the traditional view that when you die, and what matters is your legacy, what matters is what you did in your life, how you're remembered, all those sorts of things. And then there was a camp that said, no, that isn't enough. God isn't going to leave it there. And so there is going to be a resurrection, and the resurrection will occur with the coming of the Messiah. That is sort of going to initiate the resurrection, some people to live with God forever in a heaven that comes to earth, and other people to die, and to die like a final death, gone forever. During this time, there were different cultural influences having an effect on Judaism and then the Jesus movement. One of those influences was from Greek philosophy, this idea of an immaterial soul, that like there's a soul inside of you, and when you die, the soul is released. Kind of picture the cartoon. A cartoon dies, and then an image of them with white robes and maybe wings and a harp kind of float upward. Right? This idea that didn't exist in Hebrew theology throughout, almost all of the Old Testament. That was a very embodied faith. But there's this Greek idea that, the body is temporary and possibly somewhat corrupted, and that there's an uncorruptible part of you, the soul, that leaves when you die and that lives on. And so that soul is what would go to paradise or the bosom of Abraham. The Greek word for that soul, is usually translated as soul, is psyche, which is where we get the word psyche. And so there's a sense that that's your real self, your personality, your memories, who you are, remains even when your body dies. Historically, this idea of heaven is expanded upon, and what's expanded upon, in late antiquity and the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, what's expanded on is a lot of the immaterial things. Like there's a lot of art and a lot of speculation about angels, and you get the images of pearly gates and a city in the clouds, and some of the imagery that we associate with heaven now comes from this expansion on all the immaterial things, all of the spiritual in the sense of not being bodily kind of things. This especially continues as science begins to advance. There's this sense that we understand the material world better and better. With medicine, with physics, with biology, with geology, we understand the material world better and better, and so we have to kind of have God in the heavenly world, in the non-physical. And so religion is concerned with the soul, and science is concerned with the body. And that divide becomes more and more comfortable for a lot of people. And then over time, especially recently, there's been a move back in the other direction into a more embodied focus of faith. That we can't be faithful religious people, faithful Christians, if we're just worried about the soul and the afterlife and the immaterial. That this idea that we also need to be very concerned with the material, with the material conditions of people's lives, what they look like, with what we do with our resources, what we do with the world around us. Those things are becoming increasingly important, which is kind of a change in direction from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the early Enlightenment period. Speaking of funerals, now people find it very comforting to have this idea that when a loved one dies, their soul goes somewhere. And I have this conversation all the time, with people who talk about how this person I love died, but they're with God now, that they're in heaven. Maybe they're in heaven looking down on us, and that's a wonderful way to remember them, and it's very comforting, and it's certainly in the tradition. That comes from Christianity. That is an element of our faith that we have. Of course, we don't know necessarily with any certainty what heaven is like, exactly what happens when we die. And as I hope I've kind of made the point, we have differing traditions around those things as well. There isn't just one Christian teaching. There certainly isn't one Jewish teaching about what happens when you die. There are many, many teachings, a wide range of ideas from the very beginning of our tradition, like over 3,000 years ago. And we're still talking about these things. All of the ideas that I've gone through still exist here and now for us. I want to look at why this matters. And that sounds odd, right? The question of what happens when you die, the question of what will happen to you for eternity matters a great deal, obviously. So maybe I should say another reason that this matters, especially before we die, in this life, in the here and now, today. And one of the things I look at is the effect that what we think heaven is has on the world as we see it now. And whether that idea has any effect or whether it has no effect. But our ideas about heaven should have an impact on our ideas about one another and the world around us. And not just be ideas about a promise of what happens after we die, right? It shouldn't just be that. So, for example, if we believe that heaven is a place where God will beat swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks and will shatter the spear and burn the shields with fire, etc. If we imagine heaven as a place where weapons and warfare are destroyed forever, then what do we do with our cultural obsession with AR-15s and with violence? The way that we look at violence as a way to solve problems. We look at violence as a way to keep us safe. If we say that heaven is a place with no violence, what does that say to the violence that we see around us? What does that tell us about the violence we approve of and the violence we reject? Because most people approve of some violence when it's protecting them or people they love or they think it's justified. And most people reject some violence. But how does our view of heaven affect our view of violence? Or another example, if we believe that heaven is a place where every person will have their own home and their own vineyard, and no one will ever coerce them again, and that they'll be able to buy all that they need without price, that they won't have to pay for the things that they need to live and to flourish. Okay. Well, then what does that tell us about, policies that keep wages low, or refusing to raise the minimum wage? Or how does that affect the way that we look at homelessness? Like, if God's dream for eternity is that everyone has a place to live where they can care for themselves and they never go hungry, what does that say about us when we let people go to sleep outside and go hungry? Another example, if we look at Jesus's image of heaven as a great mansion, my Father's mansion has many rooms, I go to prepare one for you now, right? So if heaven is a mansion where everyone lives together and everyone has a room and everyone has a place prepared for them, then what do we do about a culture that rejects migrant people from certain places, welcoming migrant people from other places? What do we do about the simple not in my backyard arguments about when we try to build affordable housing, nobody wants that affordable housing as their neighbors? What does that say about, what does our idea of heaven say about that viewpoint? So this is the thing. I can see time has passed. I have a little clock right there on my screen that tells me you may have gone a little long. So let's try to tie it up neatly. I think it's really important to have a vision of what heaven is like, what heaven means. Whether we believe that we go there immediately when we die, or whether we believe when we die it's like going to sleep and we're waiting until the resurrection when Jesus raises us all from the dead, or whether we think that we go to kind of a paradise or a bosom of Abraham as a waiting place for the resurrection. It's important to have a strong vision of what heaven means, and to learn from the visions that we have in Scripture and in our tradition. But to me, it's also very important that that vision matters here and now. That whatever it is we say is so wonderful about heaven is something that we try to make real and true in the world during our life for ourselves and our neighbors and our community. So I encourage you to reflect on that, and I'll see you Monday.